He moved to Canada for the woman he loved. Within a year, he'd applied to 50 jobs, been rejected from all of them, and was working for free just to have something on his resume. He'd already built and sold a company before he turned 30. None of it mattered. Nobody would hire him. So he built something nobody thought he could. Before Canada, Liran Belenzon was the kind of person who doesn't usually end up unemployable. 3 years as a commander in the Israeli army, a law degree, and while he was still in school, he built Israel's first business to business e commerce marketplace, grew into the country's market leader, and exited it before he turned 30. By every metric that's supposed to matter, he was winning. Then he landed in Toronto and none of it translated. Not the army, not the law degree, not the company. 50 rejections, working for free. And then the moment that sticks with me, an investor sat across from him and told him to his face that because he was Israeli, he was going to screw things up, that he couldn't run a company. Not hadn't, but couldn't. Liran later wrote about the period in his words. He didn't feel empowered, he didn't feel strong, he felt weak, fragile, desperate. In his telling, he co-founded BenchSci because he couldn't get a job. When I started researching his story, I expected the usual founder arc. Genius spots an opportunity, builds an empire, rings the bell. This isn't that. This is a story of how the most rejected man in Toronto ended up quietly rewiring how the world discovers new medicines, and why it matters to every patient still waiting for treatment that hasn't come. While doing his MBA at the University of Toronto, Liran took a part-time gig at the Creative Destruction Lab, a startup accelerator based at the university, and his job was to recruit promising companies into the program. One of the teams he recruited was a group of 3 PhD candidates: Tom Leung, an epigenetics researcher studying cancer; David Chen and Elvis Wianda, machine learning and data experts. They'd been working on an idea: use AI to read scientific papers and pull out information that could help researchers make better decisions at the bench. Tom had lived the problem. He'd been researching whether reversing certain genetic bookmarks in cells could become a way to treat cancer. The tissue samples he'd worked with came from real patients, real people who donated their tissue to science. One day, Tom spent 12 straight hours in the lab, growing cells, collecting samples, executing every step carefully. When he ran the Western blot, the readout was blank. It wasn't because Tom did anything wrong. The protocol was sound. The antibody or the molecular detector he'd chosen to identify a specific protein, it just didn't work for that tissue type and technique. The sample was gone. And what he lost that day was a rare patient tissue, months of preparation, the trust of the person who donated it. Tom later described his coping mechanism. He'd throw away the failed tubes into a yellow biohazard bin and pretend they never existed. Don't tell my PI, he joked. And here's what most people don't realize. Tom wasn't unlucky. A landmark study found that roughly half of all research antibodies don't perform as expected. Half. This wasn't a freak accident. This was the system working exactly as designed, badly. The answer to which antibody would have worked existed, but it was buried across tens of millions of papers and nobody had organized it. Nobody had made it searchable. So researchers guessed, and when they guessed wrong, the cost wasn't just time, it was a patient's contribution to science lost. So Liran looked at this and saw something scientists couldn't. This wasn't a science problem, it was an engineer problem nobody had bothered to solve. And he proposed a deal, a 2-month trial contract. If it worked, he joined as CEO and co-founder. He had no science background, he couldn't read a Western blot, he didn't know what an antibody was, but he understood something that mattered more. The people who sell pharmaceuticals had better software than the scientists trying to create the breakthroughs. Think about that. A salesperson had better tools than a cancer researcher. So that became BenchSci's founding argument. And Liran's outsider perspective was the thing that made it visible. The scientists inside the system had accepted this as the cost of doing business. Liran walked in from the outside and saw it as absurd. And they started building. Early seed funding came in, about $2.5 million. But the rejections kept coming too. Over 100 investors said no. And the discrimination didn't stop. This is the part of the founder's story that usually gets cleaned up, but Liran didn't clean it up. He wrote about it publicly. The fear, the humiliation, the constant feeling of not being enough. And in July 2017, BenchSci launched commercially. Over 500 labs, Stanford, McGill, Mount Sinai, sick kids, signed up before the product was even made public. Then in May 2018, Inovia Capital led BenchSci Series A. $8 million US. Google's AI fund, Gradient Ventures, joined the round, and it was Gradient's first investment outside of the United States. The Globe and Mail ran a feature. CBC put them on television. Google had just validated a tiny Canadian startup built by an immigrant who couldn't get a job 3 years earlier. And from the outside, this is the breakthrough moment, the kind of headline that makes you think the hard part is over. But it wasn't. After Series A closed, Liran developed constant chest pains, anxiety, imposter syndrome. He came from a culture where, as he put it, they literally soldier on. He'd served 3 years as the commander in the Israeli army, and vulnerability was not in his vocabulary. But the weight of leading a company that hundreds of people depended on, and the guilt of barely seeing his family, and the pressure of Google's name on everything he did, it broke through. So he sought counseling. And he did something that almost no startup CEO does. He wrote about it publicly because he'd realized that soldiering on wasn't strength, it was just survival. And while Liran was rebuilding himself, BenchSci kept growing. Here's a number that puts this whole story in context. The United States alone spends an estimated $28 billion a year on preclinical research that can't be reproduced. That's not fraud or bad science. That's researchers doing their best with incomplete information and getting burned by it. That's the system that Tom lived in. That's the system that Liran decided to rewire. So over the next 5 years, BenchSci grew from antibody research tool into something much bigger. They expanded the platform to cover every type of reagent a scientist might need. Proteins, cell lines, animal models, gene editing tools. Tens of thousands of scientists worldwide started using it. Then in 2023, they launched Ascend. And this is the part that changed how we see the whole story. Ascend isn't just a search engine, it's an AI platform for the entire drug discovery pipeline. It maps the biology of disease, it generates hypotheses, it helps scientists design experiments based on the full body of existing evidence, not just the papers they've personally read, but all of them. And the results speak for themselves. BenchSci's top customer reduced unnecessary experimentation by 40%. And in 22% of key projects, scientists uncovered novel drug targets they wouldn't have found otherwise. That last number is the one that matters the most. This isn't just about cutting waste, it's about finding cures that would have been missed. And over the next 8 years, Liran raised more than $200 million from investors, including Google's AI fund and Al Gore's Generation Investment Management. And today, 16 of the 20 biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world use BenchSci. Every one of them doing work that might reach a patient. Every one of them doing it with a little less waste than before. And here's the part that I keep coming back to. Remember the beginning of the story? Liran was an outsider, the guy who couldn't get a job, the one investors dismissed because he was foreign, because he didn't have the right background, because he wasn't a scientist. Well, it turns out that was the point. The scientists inside the system had accepted a 50% failure rate as a cost of doing business. The outsider, the one who didn't know enough to accept it, was the one who saw it as a problem that could be solved. Let's go back to the lab, the Western blot, the blank screen. But now picture this. A researcher types a search. Seconds later, the platform returns validated antibodies filtered by tissue type, technique, disease model. The right answer instantly. The patient sample respected. 90% of drugs still fail in clinical trials. That number hasn't disappeared. But over 50,000 scientists are now doing their work a little smarter. And somewhere in a lab, a researcher doesn't have to throw a tube in a biohazard bin and pretend it never existed. That's not everything, but it's a start. If this story changed how you see AI, hit subscribe. We've got more coming.